Thank you. Okay. Okay, now we can start. I call on the PM.
Am I audible? I will do visible POIs, please. So like turn on your video and wave. Because I'm not gonna be checking the chat. This has supposes the narrative that travel experiences lead to a meaningful understanding of other nations. One thing on the model, what is a meaningful understanding? We think it's a deep or semi-deep ethnographic understanding of a nation, region, culture, or community. This spans more than a superficial view. It's not just seeing the Eiffel Tower and knowing what it looks like. It's about understanding the people, the culture, and the unique traditions of a foreign land. With that, three main arguments. We're going to posit that travel experiences don't lead to a meaningful understanding. We're going to posit that the type of tourism people choose to opt into changes on either side of the house. And lastly, least importantly, but a particular bugbear of mine, we're going to talk about how people discuss their vacations and the strength of their perceived social capital when they are discussing the nation when they come back home. First, on travel experiences not leading to a meaningful understanding. The vast majority of experiences that tourists have are tourist experiences. They're staying at hotels, eating in specific restaurants, siloed away from many parts of society, specifically the subaltern parts of society. This may happen because you're traveling rich, but it's also true if you stay in your hostel. Five mechanisms. One, there's your bias. You want to enjoy yourself, see enjoyable things. This necessarily means that even if you are seeking a meaningful understanding of other nations, you are looking at the fun party understanding of other nations and not the, wow, this country has real deep problems understanding of other nations. This is why people who go to India to find themselves go and hang out with elephants and go to Holi. They don't go to the Anadana slum. Secondly, the country's bias. This is especially true in countries whose tourism boards both passively and actively route tourists into certain areas and away from certain areas. Again, if you're a tourist in Myanmar trying to see the slums or trying to see the Rohingya populations, good fucking luck. Most guides will lose their license or their lives if they try to take you there. The third is the corporate incentives of the tourist companies that you necessarily must interact with to either travel, find lodging, or find food. They want to keep you happy because happy people pay money. So let's take op at their best and let's engage with the tourists who want to actively seek out authentic experiences to develop a meaningful understanding. One, these tourists don't necessarily know what authenticity is. So they're dealing with an unknown question of like the what is a true Scotsman versus not. But secondly, when they are told by a local, even if that local has bad corporatist incentives to lie, that they are wrong about their understanding of authenticity, they defer to the social capital of the local. So even when people try very hard to find meaningful understanding, the deck is stacked against them because both public and private actors within the country that they are touring have incentives to lie and whitewash their culture. Fourth, limited time and exposure to the country. When you're a tourist, you're only there for a few weeks. Maybe you're there for a semester of studied abroad, and your access is limited to a few regions and a few cities. It's literally impossible to develop a meaningful ethnic understanding of a culture and a community when you are only dealing with small silos of that community due to the limited amount of time you have to spend there. Five, and this is a major one, tourists don't work. Work is one of the most formative aspects of culture. It's the majority of the time that we spend, how we earn cash, how we accrue spending power. Eating a $3 bowl of ramen is just a great deal for us. But to a Japanese worker, that translates into a lot of hard work and specific cultural memory. We have, as tourists, no ability to access that cultural memory, and this substantially denudes our ability to gain a meaningful understanding of other nations or the culture of other nations. Lastly, I want to make a concession to the clash. It's possible to develop a meaningful understanding of a country through tourism, but all of these mechanisms can be understood as probabilistic claims. It is really unlikely that you develop a meaningful understanding. And if you gut check the examples of people who have developed a meaningful understanding of another country, I think you'll find they far more closely resemble people moving to another country and engaging in a more immersive experience than being a tourist. Second argument, the type of tourism changes. When people select their vacations, there are basically two major choices, right? You have the beach and relax vacation, or you get a culturally meaningful vacation where you try to deep dive into the nuances of that region. We think beach and relax tourism is strictly better for a couple of reasons. One, countries don't whitewash their culture for touristic consumption. Two, there's less degradation of historic sites. Three, tourism can be controlled to certain localities. And I want to be clear, right? Tourists who seek authenticity break off into two groups. They're the people who can be herded into Chichen Itza and go like, oh yes, how authentic, how great is this? And there are the people who are like, always want, who are like countercultural, and they want to stray off the beaten path simply for the sake of attempting to find authenticity. One, I will point out that straying off the beaten path does not necessarily mean you reach authenticity. There are plenty of people in remote villages in Peru who drink Coca-Cola and eat hamburgers. But two, those people have unique harms to the communities that they walk into. One, it changes where states deploy police forces to protect tourists. Tourists are seen as an incredibly important part of the revenue of many of these countries, but they're also seen as a potential threat to international relations, especially when these tourists come from Western countries that place a high premium on protecting all of their citizenries, even the morons. This means that when tourists stray off the beaten path in an attempt to find authenticity, states often have to relocate police forces and military forces in order to protect them. Two, companies come in to profit off these tourists, especially if they stray from the beaten path. Notably, this is true on beach vacations and not on beach vacations, but I'm perfectly fine with somebody setting up an ice cream shop next to a beach. It's far less good when a company moves into a neighborhood primarily characterized by minority groups and minority businesses. The warranting is simple. The potential for revenue dives market entry, and you don't need a McKinsey case study to prove it. These companies, because their own constituent members have biases and their own capital carries racial and ethnic biases, often freeze out locals or minority groups, cutting them away from the profit that tourism could bring, while pretending and claiming their culture as their own. Three, the preservation of culture as value for the indigenous community that these tourists are attempting to interact with. If you grew up worshiping at a temple, there are plenty of reasons that you'd centralize that place and experience in your sense of identity. But now the tourists come, and the temple is less a place for worship and more a place for sightseeing. Maybe you cling to your beliefs, maybe you don't, but certainly your kids won't, because they won't see the temple with the same eyes and through the same experiential lens as you did. And that is how cultural value degrades with the presence of tourists and the presence of foreign nationals who don't see the same cultural value in the places and communities that you do. Lastly, I want to observe something. If it were a small number of tourists coming into each of these places, you would very likely not see the vast majority of these impacts. But notably, when large numbers of tourists come into these places, and large numbers of tourists are the characteristic majority of tourists in the debate, you do see all of these impacts. So the op can only operate in a world in which tourism isn't taken all that seriously. And again, that's just not the vast majority of tourism. Lastly, and least importantly, how people discuss their vacations and the strength of their perceived social capital. Irrespective of the truth, when people believe that their vacations have given them a meaningful understanding of other nations, they speak with authority that they do not deserve. They speak over locals. They speak over indigenous populations. They advocate for policies that are a form of white saviorism that they then apply to the nation by claiming, I've been there, I understand these people, I know what I'm talking about. This weakens the ability for people to communicate. This weakens the ability for people to share stories, and this weakens the ability for people to generate political activism when they are talking about their nation back home. Very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the PM. Now call on the LO.
Verbal POS, please. Won't be looking at the screen. Culture exists beyond the textbooks and the newspapers. Culture is the language, the historic sites, and the people of these foreign nations. And it is because we believe that travel best fulfills a meaningful understanding of the nation that we're so proud to oppose. In this speech, two things. Big piece of framing, and then two arguments. First, on why we encourage people to travel more, and second, on how we push for a more equitable and holistic way for individuals to be thinking of foreign nations. One big piece of framing. Obviously, this narrative is not the only narrative on how you actually engage with a foreign nation. This will be one of the ways for one to have better cultural understanding. But then, what do these other narratives look like? We think these other narratives are likely dominant media narratives and reading articles that makes individuals believe they can develop a holistic understanding of a nation and allows them to develop opinions on those nations. This is important because it means that the value of this narrative of pushing for travel experiences acts as a counterbalance towards this. It teaches you that it has a heightened comprehensive and understanding only if you do actually goes towards these travel experiences, and these superficial ways of staying in your bubble to try and understand a different culture is just simply insufficient. With that, first argument, how do we encourage individuals to travel more? The first thing I want to prove is that why is this likely going to push for more travel? Two things. One, this narrative is likely constructed alongside trends such as globalization that makes individuals much more curious about other nations and therefore becomes a will for them to travel. But second, there are also obviously going to be individuals who are traveling purely for entertainment reasons, and this narrative pushes them for them to become much more culturally aware through this as well, and it becomes another priority in their goal of traveling. Importantly then, this means that probably more people of which traveling is a financial option for them that are on the margins actually choose to travel to more new and diverse nations. Second, then, why is this engagement important? Three things to say under this. One is that it meaningfully breaks cultural barriers. This is the simple contact theory argument, i.e., when you're actually physically situated within a nation, you're physically engaging with the culture of this foreign nation. The intuition pumps are very simple. You have to go to China in order to understand the vastness of the country and that the country's culture is representative of so much more than their form of governance inside the status quo and what Western liberal media is likely to paint them as. You have to go to the actual Taj Mahal in order to not only see its glamour, but also see the socioeconomic issues that is struggling within India's economy right now. This is important for two things, because one, I want to directly respond to Prime Minister's claim that work is a prerequisite and that you cannot achieve a meaningful understanding. Sure, on our side, we're not saying we don't have to defend that you're likely going to become a scholar on this foreign nation when you're now traveling in their nation, but we think that these experiences are enough for you to break your pre-existing conceptions of these nations. For example, when people come to Taiwan, they hear the languages and understand that most people are actually in Taiwan and are literate in English, and that Taiwan's actually a pretty developed nation. They're much more likely to breaking past their conceptions of, for example, going onto Economist magazine covers and thinking that the only thing about Taiwan is that China wants to invade Taiwan. But more importantly, I also want to weigh this claim about why cultural barriers is important. Because a lot of Prime Minister's claim is on this idea that people already have pre-existing biases within the nation, and this is why touristry is bad. Importantly, on our side of the house, if we can prove that we can break these cultural barriers and can meaningfully break through these stereotypes by ensuring that people have more contact with foreign nations, we're also changing the mindset and the actions of these individuals when they're engaging with these cultures, which is why our argument is actually logically prior towards theirs and is likely going to be solving for their argument. The second reason, though, why engagement is important is that it likely creates meaningful experiences. That is to say that when individuals are traveling, this is often an experience they've been preparing for a long time, and it's something that they're looking forward to. This is important for two reasons. One, on our side of the house, we also attain the unique impact of individuals just obviously having a meaningful experiences where they can bond with their friends, they can experience different countries. But second, because of this and this anticipation of this being a meaningful experience for them, individuals are more likely to become much more culturally aware, i.e., you do not sleep until 12 p.m. every time you're on vacation. You try to check out the different sites. You try to maximize your time being there, and you try to engage with as many people as possible because these are unique opportunities that is not usually accessible towards you. But thirdly, why is tourism important? With this narrative in mind, you don't just do tourism in superficial ways as proposition claims, but tourism on our side looks like three things. One, you're coming in with a respect for the culture. Even if you do not come in with the respect for the culture, you're likely to be doing it for the respect because you actually are there understanding the local situation and the local cultures, and you actually see that these people are not the way that they're portrayed to your usual bubble. Second, you're likely to want to engage with the culture in different ways. You're not just going there to be touring, but you're also going there to talk to the people. You're going there to check out the local historic sites. But a third mechanism under here is actually provided by the PM, that the local cultures themselves understand the importance of tourist industries, and it's often a large share of the country's GDP, with people specializing into tourist industry as a main source of their income. This is why individuals are A, likely to protect their historic sites because they want to attract more tourists and make it a much more sustainable source of income. But second, that these are experiences specifically tailored for tourist experiences so people can actually meaningfully engage with the authentic experiences if they do like to. Second argument then, on how do we push for a more equitable way for individuals to be thinking of foreign nations? First thing, how do people currently receive their information on how to perceive foreign nations? We argue that people default likely to epistemic authorities, i.e. your news anchors, your friends from foreign nations, etc. The problems with this is threefold. One, these bubbles are often constructed by your pre-existing beliefs because you construct the bubble that surrounds you, and therefore it's much more likely to reinforce the ideas that you already have. Second, your bubble is likely going to be siloed in the classes that you're already situated in, especially if you're a person with the financial means to travel internationally. This is likely going to be a bubble that is often very upper class, that is also likely to be ignorant of the struggles of the lower classes, and especially those within developing nations. But thirdly, it also creates a sense of complacency because you believe that the circle is already sufficiently fulfilling your understanding of these foreign nations. Therefore, you do not do anything to meaningfully want to break out of these bubbles, and you never recognize that there is more work to be done, and there perhaps is more to other cultures that is there for you to explore and for you to understand. How then do we change the way people think about foreign nations? Two things. One, obviously those with the means are traveling on our side of the house. But second, even if you don't go, the value is that even for individuals who do not have the financial means to travel, you're now doing much more research because you recognize the insufficiency of your current bubble and your current ways of trying to understand foreign cultures. Therefore, even if proposition default mechanism in the end is going to be that we can understand culture in other ways, for example, through research, which Prime Minister does not actually achieve, on our side of the house, people recognize this insufficiency and proactively do these other things. For example, like do more research in order to ensure that they're much more culturally aware and ultimately become much more globally aware citizens. Very proud to oppose.
Okay, yellow, call on DPS.
Awesome. Am I clearly audible to everyone? All right. I'll take a verbal POI at 5:30. So the only other thing I'll say is I'll have to dip at the end of the speech because I accidentally double booked myself and technically have a meeting right now. But anyway, yeah. So POI at 5:30. Is anyone not ready? In both worlds, there is a certain minority of people who want to plunge into the unknown. These are the sort of tourists who are often solo travelers, who seek out riskier and more authentic experiences because they are not lugging along a toddler in a stroller or not dealing with their significant other wanting to have a vacation. Note, however, that these people are often the minority of tourists. So let's characterize the incentives of the majority. First, oftentimes these people are driven by safety narratives. This is because people coming from Western countries are often wary of non-Western countries and perceive them to be unsafe because of exogenous media narratives that exist on both sides of the house. Two, even though they value an authentic experience to some degree, these people value even more luxury and comfort. The reason for this is that vacations are a symbol of cultural and class status and therefore must be enjoyed to some extent for someone to feel as if they are getting their money's worth from the vacation, and B, are often breaks from a grueling capitalist regime. And note often that these sort of people who are often likely to travel the world and seek out these types of experiences are the same sort of people who are often working the grindiest jobs in tech or finance and perceive this as being the only break and the thing they have earned from their monotonous view. The issue, however, is that these individuals are also pushed a narrative that travel to other countries will culturally refine and authenticate their experience. Why is this the case? First, Audie explains that there are very strong corporate incentives to push this narrative onto these individuals, as our LO helpfully characterizes for you, why this likely causes more travel to these areas. Two, where this narrative exists on the margins, I think it is often adopted by the mainstream as well. That is, very rich people see other people claiming that they are now culturally authentic as a result of having cultural experiences and say, hey, I also had an experience like that. This also applies to me. Cool. So the issue then is not when explorers believe they're being culturally authenticated, so much as it is when the Taj Mahal is now overrun with tourists who believe that they're getting a culturally authentic experience. Our first argument, and the argument that is just simply winning and never beaten by LO, is the argument about a degradation of communities. This claim is very simple. Audie tells you the narrative about cultural experiences tips the sort of vacations people are likely to undergo towards popular cultural sites and toward a greater degree of engagement with the cultural elements of a country as opposed to a resort or a beach. Why is this comparatively worse? One, the counterfactual we defend is a world in which people go to clearly designated tourist zones, which are often quite apart from the economic activity of the rest of the country. In their world, though, you often have a direct sort of migration to holy sites, to sacred places, places which the government often have a very strong incentive to pander towards Western actors, because these are the entities that are now bringing in a huge degree of economic capital in their country. Two, note the conceded argument from Audie, which is the fact that there's an emphasis on safety means oftentimes these domestic entities and countries are taking their own sort of destructive actions to maintain the supposed safety of these individuals, doing stuff like moving armed units or moving police, etc. Why do you care about the degradation of these local communities substantially more than any of their arguments about social contact theory? First, empathy is fine, but it does not reverse destruction. At best, we get 5 or 10 or 20% more empathy between individuals. But when that empathy ends, or when the vacation ends, these people go back to the United States and do nothing for people in these countries. Comparatively, when a tourist leaves and they leave with all the trash and emissions and pollutants that they came with, they're leaving a resounding effect that often compounds because it is harder to justify saving these natural places the more they are degraded and the more they are sold into the sort of tourism industry. Second, I think that people's material and capitalistic relationship with individuals often shapes their actual perception of those individuals more so than stuff like social contagion or social contact theory. That is, a world in which people's encounter with the other cultures is an encounter with the tokenized version of their shamans rather than with their actual spiritual leaders, is one in which your perception of this culture is founded on false empathy. So this is very much downstream of the clash of what sorts of things these individuals are likely to see. Let me respond directly sort of to their argument about contact theory, though, because their claim is that our world is just a world of epistemic bubbles, one in which people enjoy YouTube as opposed to traveling. First, we are just willing to bite this bullet. Even if we get a relatively less empathetic world, the fact that there are just less emissions, fewer cultural sites that are being destroyed, and less displacement and systemic destruction of local economies because of the introduction of multinational corporations into domestic economic spheres, we are certainly willing to have a slight degree of less empathy on the internet. Second, I just do think these mechanisms are better. The reason for this is there's less of a degree of false sovereignty. That is, no one goes to a YouTube video about the Rohingyas and thinks, oh, I know everything about the subject now. But someone who goes to the area and sees someone in person may actually have this false perception. Also, there's just not an existence of narratives telling people that YouTube or the internet is a very good source of information in the same way that there's an existence of narratives telling people to trust their own eyes. So often I think there's just less of a check back on their side of the house on the source of information. Finally, these mechanisms are just good. One, because they often have better and more realistic documentation of everyday life. They often center the actual voices of people on the ground. And journalists both have better training and better experience for getting people to talk and also for centering the correct perspectives for learning. And two, I just think comparatively, you're just more likely to center interesting local voices. That is, people who actually, their experience represents what it might be like to live in that country as opposed to someone who's just putting on a show for tourists. Cool. That's what that clash breaks down. Let's get a POI from closing if they have one. Okay, cool. All right. So here's how this debate breaks down.
POI from opening?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, sure. Do you think that people are going to stop being tourists on your side of the house?
So two things on the tourism question. One, obviously there's a great deal of scale or less tourism. And two, the nature of tourism changes. The argument that is still completely undealt with from the PM is that we are fine with some level of tourism. It's just that we prefer that tourism, ironically, to be to things like resorts, to be to things like capital cities, and not to be an effort to invade historical or religious sites instead. Ironically, I think the example of the Taj Mahal that the LOC uses works against them here, because certainly you're not getting an authentic understanding of all of Indian culture, or for example, the poverty that certain people in this country undergo if you're just showing up to the Taj Mahal and looking around. All right. Finally, then, we think that this narrative shapes other narratives and makes people less able to authentically engage with travel. First, it shapes what you perceive to be valuable to acquire. So you're more likely to put a lot of internal stress on yourself or stress on your broker or your agent to figure out these cool, random, mystical trips that are often just tourist scams, instead of doing what a vacation is actually meant to do and enjoying the experience or enjoying the time with your family. And you're more likely to post-rationalize this sort of tourist trap event or being scammed on the side of the road because you're sold a quote-unquote culturally authentic Hindu artifact as being a natural part of the experience that is in fact you gaining something valuable, which prevents your ability to engage with other travel narratives that check back against these things. For these reasons, we're proud to propose.
Thank the DPM. Call on the DLO.
Cool. POIs and verbally, please. Time will start in 3, 2. Tourism is a multi-trillion-dollar industry. On both sides of the house, you're going to have tourists who ride the elephants and go to Holi. The only difference is on our side, these people do more research and are more conscientious about how they engage in these places. First, I'm going to explain to you why the vast majority of people are still touring on both sides of the house. Notably, countries have incentives, given that they have huge tourist sectors, to continue to court tourists. And per the analysis from GovBench, there's still capitalistic and luxuristic needs for tourists who want to have a break from their regular life. This just means that they changed their marketing. They are still going to the Taj Mahal. It's one of the 7 wonders of the world. They're still going to the Eiffel Tower, and they're still marketing these places as being important, even if they aren't important to your understanding of that nation. You are still going to famous holy sites because they are famous holy sites, and they are one of the things you should do while you are in a country, because that is how it is marketed to people when they choose to go to countries in the first place. Think of brochures. Think of how people talk about the country. Think of the first thing that comes up when you Google the country and its notable sites. This means that on both sides of the house, house, you are still doing these things. However, the difference is on their side of the house, when there's never an incentive to try and know more about the country or become closer to the country, you become a purveyor and you become someone who is extractive of the country without any need or any incentive to try and do better. This means that you are still on their side of the house going to leave trash at those sites, still degrade those sites, still go off the beaten path because there are still tourist traps in those areas, but you never have an incentive to grow. What does this mean specifically on the question of resorts? It means that you're still going to build the resorts, but now instead of doing things like increasing the infrastructure in places that people would want to go to, you're just going to bulldoze them down to create that resort for the luxury life, because people don't care about the negative effects of tourism. They only care about their experience. I'm going to engage specifically with the 5 mechanisms from Prime Minister. They say that you have, for example, a bias to have fun. True, both sides that bias exist. What happens on our side uniquely? If on our side you recognize that your tourism is more than just you having fun and engaging your capitalist conscientious consumption fantasy, you recognize that tourism is something that is more than just going to places. So you do far more research into what it's like on the ground in those places, where you should go, where you shouldn't go, how locals want you to engage in tourism. And this is all research that we already tell you at Leader is likely to happen at the point at which you recognize that tourism is something that can be personally important or meaningful. And secondarily, when you're on the ground and you recognize that your experience can inform your own worldview and cut back against your own biases, you're more likely to then, for example, talk to locals or be willing to do things like not disrespect temples or holy sites because you recognize them first as important cultural centers for the people in those areas, and second as things for your own enjoyment. On their side of the house, your bias to have fun comes first, and it is the only bias you have. There's never a check back against that. Next, on the question of countries and corporations, on the question of how tourism exists, I'm just going to flip their argument. They presuppose that if you go to cultural sites, those sites get degraded and destroyed, and instead you go to beaches and resorts. 2 issues. First, on the cultural sites, those cultural sites are in many places falling apart at the seams because there's just not enough money. That is, there's not enough genuine interest in these places outside of tourism. The tourism is the proximate link that leads to things like funding restoration projects, as you have seen all across the world when it comes to famous pieces of art or old like Catholic cathedrals that are being held up by cities that recognize them as important for culture, for tourists and monetary reasons. Without this, these places literally just crumble into dust, and you still lose the cultural connection to these places. On our side of the house, you're able to repair them and keep them in good shape. And beyond that, you're able to tell people how to engage in those sites. On their side of the house, they're bulldozed down. Secondly, on the question of resorts, we tell you that a lot of these places just don't have beaches or have tourism sectors in places that don't have easily accessible beaches. What happens instead? You do have lots of luxury resorts, but those resorts literally destroy and gentrify the areas around them. That is, if you are someone who lives in a small home and that home now increases in price tenfold to live there because they want to put a resort there for tourists, it's going to be much harder for you to live and have your way of life, which flips the argument they make on the question of minority communities and them getting excised and destroyed. It's just far more likely in a world in which the person who goes to these areas doesn't care about the fact that they're destroying them. Next, on the question of time and exposure and work, we already deal with at LO the idea that work doesn't matter, but we think that time and exposure actually is important. We've already explained to you that there's a lot of cultural cross-cutting, or even if you just have a number of conversations on the ground, it allows you to have a heightened understanding of what happens in these places versus what you see in the counterfactual, which is just going to YouTube or going to your local news report. That leads me to the second main clash, which is that how people interact with the idea of tourism / their own personal experiences in the media and in research. Because the second part of our LO is that what happens is now you're far more likely to check back against the biases you hear on YouTube or on TV. The response they give you at Deputy is that no one recognizes these as important and thinks that people lie all the time. This is just observationally untrue. A lot of people think that YouTube and or news anchors who they watch daily on nightly news are epistemic anchors who have a lot of authority in the community. And the reason why they believe this is because they have some perceived importance because they exist as someone with multiple million subscribers or someone who makes hundreds of thousands of dollars on the nightly TV. And when they hear things about countries, they just believe them de facto, which leads to things like, in the most extreme case, wanting to push for bad policy. But even in the mild case, things like microaggressions or dismissal about other cultures. If it is the case that you recognize that there's something more to a culture than just what you see and hear on TV, you're more likely to then not accept those as absolutely true and either one, want to seek out your own idea of what the culture is via qualitative research on your own, or B, go to those places and engage in them well. Before I continue, is there a point from closing?
Yeah, if influencers are the one who gets to dictate what are the countries look like, don't you think there is a chance that people will misunderstand of like the country's political stature and all those things?
Yes, absolutely. But notably, this happens on both sides. On our side of the house, even if there is a chance of misunderstanding the country, there's a lower incentive to do so because there's social backlash towards badly portraying a country when a large swath of research exists. And you're likely to listen to other locals or listen to people who are indigenous to that area, which is also responsive to the GovBench claim. If it is the case that you recognize that there's something more to the country than what you see or hear, you're also likely to listen to others who have more experience in that country, which gives them the platform. On your side of the house, they're still misrepresented, but it's a lot harder for those people who hear those misrepresentations to actually check back against the fact that they're false. The next thing I want to talk about then is on the type of tourist, because they give you a push that's like the tourist does really bad things, goes off the beaten path, and that we would prefer if less of those tourists exist. We just explained to you that the empathy that happens in these situations is important in the long term, but that more seriously, these people who would go off the beaten path aren't a large majority of tourists, and in the cases they do choose to do that, we posit they do it well and that they understand when and why they're doing it. Very proud to oppose.
Take the speaker, call on the member of Gov.
Am I both audible and
Yes.
visible? Just give me 1 second. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. There is a huge problem in the opening house debate, which is that both of the sides are talking about what are the harms and what are the benefits of tourism. And none of the sides really tries to unlock the whole debate, which is essentially about narrative and how that essentially the narrative plays out in terms of the actors and so on and so forth. So what we are going to do is very simple. We're going to run, first of all, why this narrative is likely to play out in real world and what are the harms to this. The most likely representation of this particular narrative being played out is that you as a person, you as an average individual who probably don't have the money to visit Bangladesh, India, or some other places from a developed country where there is a political tension going on or something like that, or there is an economic tension or there is an ethnic tension going on, you're likely to look into the people who are vloggers, who are people who are likely to be visiting those places and giving you all the updates because, you know, the quote unquote experts are unable to go and visit onto those places at the same time. And this is a real particular example of what happened in terms of places like India and so on and so forth. When there was an actual tension in Kashmir, what the Modi government essentially did was basically just hiring different influencers and like basically get them there and show them the version of Kashmir that they wanted to show to the real world and basically sponsor those videos and basically ensure that those particular videos are the particular representation that essentially gets accessed by the wider majority of people who don't get to particularly like visit different places because of lack of opportunity, because probably you have work to do, probably you don't have the money to go to those places, probably you're just not interested in actually accessing the meaningful representation of real world. Why is this particular narrative so important in terms of making sure that these influencer gets the credibility at the first place? This is just true because all of the analysis that opening opposition gives you, right? You essentially think that the expert that are providing opinion in these cases haven't really gone to those places. So all of the opinions that they're providing are somehow politically motivated, somehow in a way in which is not the real representation of what the world look like. But that isn't essentially true. You probably can still make quite a good conjecture, even if as an expert, you haven't really gone to visit those particular places, or if you haven't really been into that particular place at the same time. But secondarily, and more crucially, those videos are made in a particular way in which that essentially also gives you, further strengthens this idea that you have the particular expertise that are essentially required for able to educate a certain majority of people who are your audiences, who are big in number. This shifts the vlogging industry in a particular way that it is no longer about entertainment, but it's more about a platform in which you derive education, you learn about the ways in which those cultures operate and the ways in which these cultures are likely to be, or this political spectrum of this country is likely to play out. The biggest problem in both opening government and opening opposition side is that they miss out on the vast majority of people who are never likely to travel and is likely to extract information from from the people who are traveling these particular places. This particular mechanism allows us to access all of the harms that I'm now going to explain to you what happens in the real world, as I explained to you about like the promoted or the sponsored representation of what Kashmir looks like in general. Essentially, this state essentially have all of the incentives to do this, and also you as a traveler also have the incentive to get sponsored, because it's a lot of money. You get to be staying in really good hotels, and you get to meet the very important people. You get to make videos with the person who is the prime minister of that particular place. You also get access to the whole region of that particular place, which is to say, you as a YouTuber have all the incentive to be accessing all the Modi supporters who are there, so that they subscribe to your channel and they make you richer, even if you don't buy all of the analysis that those particular places, or they do it based on state sponsorship, even if you don't buy that mechanization. This means those influencers have a perverse incentive to basically represent those videos in a way that are supportive to the majority of individuals, which looks like the majority people living in India or the majority of people living in Bangladesh, who have no incentive whatsoever to basically represent the minorities in a way that they are vulnerable, because this hurts, first of all, their image of their religion, or that also hurts the image of their country as a whole, which essentially means that those individuals, when they see, when they represent these particular images, you're likely to have a very twisted idea about what this political representation really is like. You as a particular person, when you look into those videos as an average individual, you're likely to think, oh, but wasn't there a whole ethnic conflict that was going on in Kashmir? Wasn't BJP trying to get rid of all those people, or like destroy hospitals or something like that? Wasn't in those places there are likely to be huge level of problematic things that are likely to happen? And also there is also incentive for these influencers to be motivated in a very elitist manner. I think OG does talk about this a little bit, but this particular mechanization of one, the representation happens through media channels, allows us to have the actual impact. Before I move on to the analysis, I will take opening opposition.
Sure. Aside from the fact that shocking firsthand accounts are algorithmically boosted, it's a lot easier for a government to pay off a news station than it is for them to pay off the full first page of YouTube bloggers.
The reason why that particular argument doesn't really exist is because you probably get, first of all, there's so many checks and balances. You probably have to pay way more to be able to do that. But second of all, you probably get this particular thing. Like in YouTube, you said state-sponsored media or something like that. You're less likely to be believing on those things, because you're likely to think, oh, this is not a third party. This is just them trying to really acknowledge whatever is wrong with them. But second of all, the whole analysis I gave, like news channels and all of those things, are likely to do it without really probably being there or something like that, is also a proper recognition. But even let's say you don't buy any of this, you don't believe that this happens, but the crucial thing is how this is likely to be whitewashed in a way. The representation by these influencers are likely to be whitewashed, or there is going to be poverty porn that are going to happen. For example, in Bangladesh, there came a certain amount of influencer who just came up here and tried to talk about how they face scams, or how they had a lot of issues in terms of their lifestyles, or and a lot of other things were they had issues. And those are the problems that some of the influencers that are not partial would also like to talk about. And these are the point in time you promote those particular views, and it is also likely to change the views in which you look at those countries. And even at their worst case, base case of scenario, this is likely to be problematic, because you get a very whitewashed image of those particular areas, which is not the true representation. For all this reason, we are the only team that does the right mechanization, and we win.
Take the member of Gov. Call on member Ball.
I'm going to talk in this speech about how I think this narrative actually manifests. And I think the largest place where it's going to affect anything is not really in the how you say the economy of tourism, because there's a lot of other factors that affect that. Where I think this changes a lot is in the conversations that people have after they've come back, and what they talk about with their friends and their family when they talk about the tourist experience, right? Do they talk about the awesome club they went to? Do they talk about the fun stuff they did? Or do they try and explain what was different about that society, right? I went to Japan. Do I talk about oh, the food I ate was really good, or do I try and make like a more sort of meaningful point about how the society and the social norms in that culture are very different from the one I came from? What I want to talk about is why I think these observations are actually quite good within these conversations people have about their tourist experiences, unlocking a lot of the sort of check and balance to negative social perceptions that opening opposition, I think, tried to make, but absence an understanding of how this narrative manifests doesn't ultimately unlock those impacts. So I think the first thing to observe here is that a lot of these observations people make about their understanding are relatively trivial, right? I talked to a person and they were very, very nice to me. I saw a bunch of things and that was interesting. And so most of this meaningful understanding, which I think most people understand is not an authentic experience, right? When someone who doesn't speak the language of the home country that they're going to is talking about this, right? Most of these are relatively trivial observations they make about the people that they met there. But I think for most people, these experiences that they have are extremely good. And the reason I think most people have good experiences when they're on sort of travel is because, first of all, like you're taking a break from work, you're somewhere new, like you're usually doing things that are relatively pleasurable. And opening government themselves acknowledge that societies want to sort of structure their economy in a way so as to ensure tourists have a good time and talk good about the time that they were there, right? They want to make sure the people at the resorts are good. A lot of people are working for tips. And so all of this means that the average, like, regular Joe slob tourist is going to have a very, very positive experience while on vacation in a foreign country. What that means then is that the people that they talk to, the people they interact with, are people they come away with having positive experiences towards. The opening government case here, and like the closing government response as well, is that while this is going to lead to some level of like false expertise, and these people are going to think they understand this culture better than they do. Even if this is true, it's unclear why this is necessarily a bad thing in any way. Because let's think about two different case studies. One is if you live in a place where the talking over of a local could conceivably happen. So you live in like a multicultural city like New York or something, and you're going to be talking about your experience vacationing in India with somebody who was born and raised in India. I think in these sorts of environments where that talking over of locals could happen, or like yeah, I guess that's the only case I can imagine this happening. I just don't think most regular people are going to perceive this tourist, even if they understand, they have a meaningful understanding, that they're going to think this person is more of an expert than someone who actually grew up there. So I don't think there's a lot of, there's that much of a margin here in terms of false expertise. And in societies where people are going to perceive this sort of person who spent 2 weeks in India as being some kind of expert, presumably this is a relatively ignorant, secluded kind of society, right? So this is somewhere when you haven't met anybody who's Indian, where someone going to India is like a relatively novel, exciting thing. And in that kind of society, I have to imagine that this is still a significant improvement, because given the positive interactions that person's likely to have while on vacation, in a place where nobody knows anything about India, that's probably shifting the sort of Overton window, or shifting the level of discourse people are having in a positive way. Because now when somebody says something bigoted or says something negative or very, very ignorant, like obviously, that person goes, well, hey, I had this like experience. I met a lot of Indian people at my hotel. I got led around by my Indian tour guide who was like trying to get tips from me, but I had a really positive experience. I had a fun time there. So I don't think a lot of these ignorant, racist things you're saying are particularly fair, because I have this sort of personal experience that otherwise I wouldn't have. Before I weigh out why I think this is a round-winning contribution, I'll take something from opening if there is anything.
Why is it that you can't have a positive experience without believing you have a meaningful understanding of the culture?
You can have obviously a positive experience, but the problem is, do you relay that conversation to your family and friends, and do they believe that that is something that they should care about or take seriously, right? Because if we don't support a narrative that travel experiences give people a meaningful understanding, when people are talking about these experiences, they don't discuss this, right? If you don't think somebody has an understanding at all, if we take the perception you give us of tourism, that it's just a thing you're supposed to have fun, that it's basically, you know, just about staying in the hotel or chilling on the beach and relaxing. Well, we're not talking about the nation, right? We're not talking about the people who live there. We're not talking about the names and faces of the people we interacted with. And we're not discussing, like, when somebody says something bigoted about India and how, you know, this is like a backwards culture or something, well, we're not going to take seriously the opinion of anybody who lives there, right? Because if they don't have any kind of understanding, well, it's just not very meaningful. So I think this unlocks all of the points on improving social discourse and improving sort of like all the contact theory points. All of it's contingent on this narrative manifesting in conversations in the way we've described. So I think we take the round for that reason.
Make the MO call on the Gupway.
Hello, am I clearly audible and visible? Okay, just give me 10 seconds. Okay, so starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So I'm going to talk about two broader things in my speech that actually explicitly deal with opening opposition and closing opposition in general. So first thing I want to point out is that how does the tourist are actually interact that how, after the tour, after they actually visiting a tourist spot, and I think that is the most important thing in this debate, because most of the opposition case are probably the closing opposition talk about that, look, that why the positive experience matter, and probably, but they don't actually prove us that why this positive experience can actually lead to a meaningful experience. And opening opposition actually prompts out, talks about that why probably you will get more visitor in more tourists in most instances. Panel recognize that how does the tourists are actually interact in our side of the house in more realistic way. Three things. Number one, the more instance, what is their priority? More often I go to particular instance, probably go for a particular fun or enjoyment of the examination, or probably the after the hectic schedule of the workplace. The probability is that more instances, they have less incentive to talk about the struggle of the locality in most instances, because this is the reasons, this is the more realistic, because they actually go fun and they, more often they don't have any politically aware idea in most instances. But the second micro analysis that more instance, the people who are actually serving to them through the tourist spot are have been largely selective. For example, if you talk about the ethnic community, probably the people who are going to serve this particular tourist people, they're also a recruit process, and probably the most people who are actually they have been selected in a way so that they don't actually talk about a lot about the struggle they are facing in their day-to-day life. So this is the first reason that why this is going to be happen. What are the impact? The impact is that there is an information gap even if you go to this particular places, and therefore probably you number one, you have less incentive, but secondarily there have been a power of vacuum of information that actually leads you to the conclusion that these people are significantly suffered throughout this process. Number one. But number two, what are their actually looks like? Probably they're going for the posting videos and focusing on the positive things of this particular instance, because probably the state are actually manifest in particular way. That is problematic, because more instance that actually the extension speaker actually talk about that why in most instances these particular things are actually overshadow the negativity of this particular local community are actually faced in more instance. But the third important thing is that the short-term biases of this particular tourist people, because panel recognize they are already tired and fucked up in their day-to-day life, and they are probably getting to this particular tourist spot for some the mental satisfaction, or probably having a lot of fun. I don't think when they actually getting the natural view, or probably the some sort of hospitality through the process of this particular locality, I think they have less incentive to come forward and talk about the struggle they are facing in most instances. All of these three analyses are actually suggested that why in more instances the average tourist people who are actually visit to these particular places, they have been more often they don't actually care about lot, or probably have less incentive to talk about that reality. Why this piece of analysis are important in this debate? Because panel recognize most of the contention that come from opening opposition is that look, probably you have more cultural barrier breaking barrier, or probably you can get more understanding of the socio-economic culture. I get even if you get this, but I'm not sure that why that is meaningful, or probably can get and probably effective way to actually getting or probably have an impact on this particular ground at the very first moment. But second thing that come from opening opposition is that look, probably you can do more research. I have already told you that how it actually looks like. But second important response is that they talk about that look, probably you are probably getting time and exposure most things. I have already talked about that how in general they are going to be do these particular things, and that's the reasons why most of the impact that coming from opening opposition is not realistic in this debate. So I think opening opposition are not getting over from us. Now coming to closing opposition. Before going to closing opposition, second piece of argument analysis are I think that is most important. Like Hamid explicitly told you that that particularly why you are going to be misleaded or represent the narrative and how it actually looks like. Hamid talks about three things. One, you are more likely to hiring the influencer that is going to talk for you for the particular pro state pro government talking about. A secondarily politically motivated review, and probably this actually gives you the validation of the government in general. But panel recognize, I want to posit that why this is the most important argument in this debate. Because panel recognize in both sides of the house, probably there are a lot of countries, probably this particular narrative probably doesn't affect a lot. Because probably if I talk about the Germany or the Turkey, probably this particular country have already a pre-existing historical things that actually helps them to actually explore or exploration of their own cultural heritage. But the debate actually explicitly actually helps this debate should be in more affected the vulnerable community, vulnerable country, probably which are now marginalized, i.e. probably India, probably the Myanmar, probably to some extent the Nepal, who are actually getting bashed by the neighboring country India. So I think this is the most important things in this debate, because panel recognize how this particular narrative going to be manifest in a negative way, and that actually contribute the negative utility to this particular community. I think that is the most important thing in this debate, and Hamid can explicitly show you that why this is the most important argument in this debate. Closing opposition unfortunately didn't engage with us that why that engaged with our extension at the very first moment. But the second important thing, I felt opening closing opposition, most of the contribution about that why this creates a positive experience, I think now it is less likely to be viable, because after all the analysis that I have already talked about. Now coming to the why opening government, we actually take opening government at their best. Opening government at best, they actually come up with a lot of the impact. For example, that probably you are getting exposure, probably why these particular things are actually going to be exploitation and etc. But I think opening government lacks the mechanization, and secondarily, lot of the claim doesn't actually manifest with the motion, because the motion explicitly suggests you that how this particular narrative and how the impact are going to be generated by this narrative. I think opening government means the framing in at best, because most of their contribution seems like that why tourism is probably bad, but probably closing government is the only team that actually explicitly told you that how this particular narrative are actually shift away and how this particular narrative are going to help the most vulnerable people in this particular debate. For all of the reasons, we are extremely proud to propose.
Okay, I think Whip, call on off Whip to close the debate.
Okay, just give me 1 second to set up my timer. Okay, I'll begin in 3, 2, 1. When we're discussing the narrative that travel experiences lead to a meaningful understanding of other nations, I think it's important that we note that it's just that, a narrative. And in order for any impacts to be incurred in this round, we must explain what is logically prior to any of the impacting we get from top half, that this narrative is actually something that convinces. And that's what Diggory explicitly does for you, which is why we are winning this debate. So CG tells us that we haven't explicitly proved why this is going to be a meaningful change, why this narrative is going to be taken accurately. I think Diggory accurately explains to you that at the point that people are actively perceiving their own experiences as something that is striving for meaningfulness, they'll be able to thus relay those experiences to the people back home, so on and so forth, in ways that are centered specifically on the meaningful understandings, as opposed to just talking about their experiences in self-indulgent manners, right? I think it's also important to note that it is contemporary to be depthful and niche, right? It's something that a lot of people strive towards. I think people would rather feel academically or authentically engaged or inclined in these cases. And when it becomes a narrative about travel, that it is to say we should be striving for meaningful understandings, people would rather opt into that because you'd rather be on the more authentic and academic side, which seems more positive. Okay. On some points against our closing government. So closing government tells us that influencers receive this perverse incentive to educate. So now at this point, they feel incentivized to forward their knowledge. Firstly, I think it's presumptuous to say that people get their perceptions of worlds and cultures by influencers solely. I think people likely get information from those who are proximate to them. Me personally, when I'm wondering about a specific country, maybe at 5 minutes, I'll see what my dad has to say about it, or like I'll hear what my friends have told me, and that's the first thing that comes to mind, because that's how you make those flashbulb memories, when it's someone who's telling you a specific experience that had some emotion attached, as opposed to a TikTok video that I'm scrolling through that I don't really resonate with, right? I think it's important that those proximate conversations are those ones that we remember most, and as Diggory explains to you, those proximate conversations are now shifted towards good, meaningful memories and recollections of what has happened in a specific country. Even if we aren't getting our information from those who are most proximate to them, I think the majority of their extension is quite symmetric, right? Influencers are incentivized on either side of the house to give educational content that's probably skewed towards one benefactor or another, because that's where the money is and the niche is for travel media, right? Most viewers of these types of media and so on are viewers from Western liberal democracies, which means they'll be incentivized to make these things palatable towards them. So no matter what, on both sides of the house, influencers will feel the need to educate others. Now, why do we think it's better for this narrative to be spreading at the point that influencers are educating? And it's on this point of false expertise that rings a theme throughout the entire round. We would rather those who have been pushed with this narrative to actually seek meaningful understanding to claim the false expertise, because we tell you there are so many reasons, contact theory, there are so many reasons, discussions with locals contributing to, understanding understanding cultural ideologies, so on and so forth, directly interacting with locals, that give you even a slight edge of being able to have those meaningful experiences. And at the point that you're actively seeking out those meaningful experiences, at least you've been there. Without this narrative, you're less incentivized to travel. And we've proved to you that it is important to be able to actually indulge yourself in those cultures, to have this new perception in order to combat the stereotypes and other preconceived notions. Okay. Now on the diagonal, OG tells us that travel experiences are not going to lead to meaningful understandings. They tell us this big point on like the preservation of culture. But firstly on the narrative that the idea of travel is like indulgent or luxury. I think when we're talking about the specific narrative that travel experiences lead to meaningful, the idea of that narrative is that you're likely to want to adopt cultural practices. You're likely want to attempt to engage with more local restaurants or more niche sites. Because when we're talking about a meaningful experience, what rings true is that it's probably a narrative away from typical tourism activities. Because you don't want to be seen doing the basic whitewash tourist things, because you're not going to think that that's a meaningful experience, because we already know collectively that there are some things that are just typically tourist activities, like going to the beach, indulging in luxuries. So you're going to want to shift away from those things. No matter to what extent they find that true authenticity, we prove a higher likelihood of respectful interaction, because you're going to want to shift to more smaller places. I think their point on preservation of culture doesn't stand then, because what can be harmful is collective mass tourism, which can destroy cultures. This looks like, sure, I'll take a POI quickly.
Yeah, under your side of the world, when these influencers are likely to promote ideas, why are they not likely to promote the ideas that resonates with their perception?
I already told you that influencers are kind of symmetrical on both sides of the house. I don't think people are getting their main opinions on countries from influencers. I've already dealt with that. Anyways, so I think the idea also that collective mass tourism is one that's going to destroy culture, because that's where you're more likely to, have littering. You're more likely to see like disruptive practices in it. The narrative works against this, because this narrative pushes you to not go to these mass cultural sites, to not go to, or not collectively go as a group together, or not litter or do things that are following the cultural norms, such as maybe being silent in Japan when you're going on the streetcars, because you know that that's something that is within their cultural ideologies, right? I think also there's this falsely prescribed gatekeeping. Like when I go to church, for instance, I'm taught to embrace others. I'm taught that human connection is important. So when this is done in respectful ways, I think you can make meaningful connections with those you're touring with. I think that's important. I don't think just the existence of someone who's not from your country in a place that you share is ultimately harmful. I think it's just the practices by which we use that. Now, to weigh us over our opening half, as I've told you, it is logically prior to prove to you that this narrative is actually going to be something that convinces people, and that it's going to be convincing people in a good way. And Diggory's explained to you the ways in which this manifests, such as when you come back and you're speaking with people and you finally have a good impression. We tell you it uniquely legitimizes those travel experiences to improve social discourse and combat stereotyping. Proud to pose.
Okay, I think the OpWhip, thank everyone for the debate. If you could all go back into the main hall, my panelists and I will deliberate, and we will come back and get you when we're ready.